Her smile is the most famous mystery in human history. Every year, millions of art pilgrims stand transfixed before the bulletproof glass of the Louvre, trying to unravel this woman's secret. We're told of divine harmony, the golden ratio, and the genius of pure beauty. But history is no glossy guidebook. If you were to strip away 500 years of praise and varnish from this canvas, you would uncover something that could shock even a seasoned modern viewer. For the hands that so tenderly painted these lips spent their nights delving into the rotting entrails of the dead, searching for the place where the soul hides. The man we have placed on a pedestal as a titan of the Renaissance spent his life balancing on the edge of the scaffold. He was accused of sodomy and considered a godless man. He was as obsessed with death as he was in love with life. Who was he, really? A serene old man with a long beard, as we are used to seeing him in his self-portrait, or a bold, handsome, and self-destructive rebel who wore pink cloaks, bent horseshoes with his bare hands, and despised public morality. How could the angels of Raphael and the demons of Bosch coexist in one mind? How could the creator of the most perfect beauty sketch the ugliness of decay by the light of a candle stub with the precision of a pathologist? If you are ready to learn the truth about the most scandalous, controversial, and tragic figure of the 15th century, a man whose real biography is more terrifying and magnificent than any fiction, subscribe to our channel, Personalities in Detail, as we begin our major investigation. This is not just the story of an artist. It is a court case they have tried to close for half a millennium. We are transported to Florence, but forget the sun-drenched postcards of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. Our Florence is a city of narrow, dark alleys where the rot of vice hides behind luxurious velvet. It is a city of bankers, schemers, and the tamburi, sinister boxes for anonymous accusations placed in the corners of churches. It is here, amidst marble and mud, that the drama of an illegitimate son begins. A son destined to change the world, but who nearly burned in its flames before he even had a chance to start. Welcome to an era where beauty was paid for with blood. On April 15th, 1452, at the third hour of the night, the cry of a newborn echoed through a small stone house in the village of Anciano, near the town of Vinci. This cry did not announce the arrival of an heir. It announced a scandal. Leonardo was born on the wrong side of the marriage bed. His father was Ser Piero da Vinci, an ambitious notary whose career was aimed at Florence. His mother was a simple peasant girl named Caterina, whose name history has preserved only by a miracle. A bastard. Illegitimate. In the 15th century, this word was not just an insult, it was a legal sentence. It barred the boy from the heavy oak doors of universities. He was forbidden from becoming a lawyer like his father or a doctor. He was denied the study of Latin and Greek, the languages of science at the time. It seemed fate had passed its verdict. He was to be an uneducated outcast. But this very brand of shame became his greatest gift. Deprived of dusty books and scholastic dogmas, young Leonardo turned to the only teacher that never lies, nature. He became, as he would later call himself with both bitterness and pride, an uomo senza lettere, a man without book learning. His classroom was the Tuscan hills. His textbooks were the flow of rivers and the flight of dragonflies. Loneliness became his constant companion. Can you picture this child? He wanders the woods alone, watching for hours as water flows around stones, sketching it in his first notebooks. He learns to see what others pass by without a glance. It was there, in his deep childhood, that an event occurred which, 400 years later, would compel Sigmund Freud to write an entire treatise on the psychosexuality of a genius. Leonardo recalled a single dream from his cradle, or perhaps it was a hallucination. He imagined a kite descending from the sky. The bird of prey lands on the edge of his cradle, opens his mouth with its tail, and repeatedly strikes his infant lips. What was it? A sign of being chosen? A seal of fate? Or, as 20th century psychoanalysts believed, the first manifestation of repressed desires and a deep, painful attachment to the mother who was taken from him and given to his father's wealthy household to be raised. This kite haunted him his entire life. Leonardo always felt different, an outsider, an observer cast upon this planet from another world. He grew up strange. He was too handsome, too smart, and frighteningly talented for provincial Vinci. According to legend, his father once asked him to paint a wooden shield for a peasant. Leonardo did not just paint a picture. He gathered lizards, snakes, bats, and crickets in his room, dismembered them, and created a monster from their parts, spewing venom and fire. When Ser Piero entered the room, he recoiled in horror. So realistic was this monster, born from death for the sake of art. The notary understood. This boy had no place in the village. His talent was as dangerous as a fire in a dry forest. In 1466, Ser Piero made a decision that would change the course of art history. He took his 14-year-old son to Florence. They traveled to a city where the air was thick with the smell of paint, money, and blood. His father led him to the most famous, bustling, and advanced workshop of the time, to a man who was a sculptor, jeweler, painter, and engineer all in one, Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio's workshop resembled a foundry from the underworld more than an abode of the muses. It smelled of burnt bone, egg yolk, molten bronze, and men's sweat. It was a crucible in which the Renaissance itself was being forged. Among the apprentices were a young Sandro Botticelli and Pietro Perugino. But when this illegitimate boy from Vinci appeared in the doorway, the rhythm of the hammers faltered for a moment. Leonardo was outrageously, indecently handsome. You must understand, he was no pale recluse withering away over an easel. Contemporaries describe an athlete with a mane of golden hair who could bend an iron horseshoe with one hand and stop a frightened horse at a gallop with the other. He wore short pink tunics that reached his knees, revealing strong legs, an act of defiance bordering on debauchery by the standards of stern Florentine morality. He was a dandy, an aesthete, a living sculpture that breathed and laughed. But beneath those pink silks beat the heart of a cold analyst. While other students copied ancient statues, Leonardo observed. He watched how the tendons tensed on a model's neck, how light fell on the folds of fabric, how water swirled into a vortex in a gutter. For him, art was not an end, but a tool for the vivisection of reality. The climax arrived when Verrocchio received a commission for the painting The Baptism of Christ. The master, overloaded with work, instructed his apprentice to paint just one detail, the angel holding Christ's garments in the lower left corner. This was common practice. Apprentices often finished backgrounds or secondary figures. But what happened next has gone down in legend as the moment of death for the old art. Leonardo took the brush. He did not use tempera, the egg yolk-based paint that everyone, including his master, used. He dared to experiment with oil and created a face of such ethereal, luminous transparency, of such startling life, that the figures painted by Verrocchio himself seemed wooden and lifeless beside this angel. It was a triumph, and it was a catastrophe. Salaì writes that upon seeing his student's work, Andrea del Verrocchio threw down his brush and vowed never to touch paints again. The student had not just surpassed the master, he had annihilated him, showing how outdated he had become. At 20 years old, Leonardo became the finest artist in Florence. It seemed the whole world lay at his feet, ready to kiss his pink shoes. But there was another side to this coin. His dazzling beauty and success became a magnet for envy. Florence, this city of flowers and art, was also a city of spies, gossip, and anonymous assassins. In the very heart of the city, on the walls of the Palazzo Vecchio, on the wooden box with a slot, known as the tamburo, the devil's mailbox. Any upstanding citizen could drop a note in it to destroy a neighbor, a competitor, or an enemy. And on April 9, 1476, a hand dropped a note inside that nearly turned humanity's greatest genius into a pile of ash. The note named 4 men, among them Leonardo da Vinci. The accusation was short, brutal, and deadly: sodomy. The anonymous accuser claimed that Leonardo and 3 other young men had committed a sin against nature with the 17-year-old Jacopo Saltarelli. Saltarelli was well known in Florence, a goldsmith's apprentice who moonlighted as a male prostitute, a youth of ill repute whose name appeared with frightening frequency in police records. For Leonardo, this was not just a scandal. It was a death sentence. The law in Florence was harsh. Sodomy was punished with fines, branding, and in particularly grave cases, being burned at the stake. Fire. That was what he feared most. Imagine the horror. The man who worshipped the beauty of the human body was threatened with being turned into a charred piece of flesh in the main city square to the jeers of the crowd. He was 24 years old. His entire life, all the unpainted pictures, all the undiscovered laws of nature, could have vanished in a single burst of orange flame. The officers of the night in monasteries, the so-called morality police, arrested him. From the sunlit workshop smelling of varnish and oil, he was thrown into a foul cell in a Florentine prison. We can only guess what went through his mind in those days. He, who wore pink tunics and perfumed gloves, found himself amidst filth, lice, and despair. But worse than the prison walls was the humiliation. His private life, his secret passions, were turned inside out and put on public display like an animal's entrails at the market. The proud, solitary aesthete was forced to justify whom and how he loved. The trial dragged on for 2 agonizing months. For 2 months, he lived with a noose around his neck, waiting for the knock on the door that would announce the end. But the knock never came. The charges were dropped. It is likely that his father's influential patrons intervened, or perhaps the accuser simply could not find witnesses willing to confirm the sin under oath. Leonardo was released, but Florence, this city of flowers, art, and humanism, suddenly became unbearably suffocating for him. The air here was poisoned by gossip. On the streets, people no longer saw him as a promising genius, but as that guy who was dragged to the morality police on a shameful charge. He had to flee. Flee to a place where no one knew him, to a place where they valued not the subtlety of the mind and philosophical discourse, but strength, steel, and ambition. To Milan. And here begins one of the most astonishing deceptions of his biography. Leonardo, now 30 years old, wrote a letter to the ruler of Milan, the cruel, pragmatic, and dangerous Ludovico Sforza, nicknamed Il Moro, or the Moor. This letter has survived to this day, and it is perhaps the most audacious resume in human history. Do you think he wrote about his angels? About how he could lay shadows that seemed to breathe? Not a word. Leonardo understood the psychology of a tyrant. A tyrant does not need beauty. A tyrant needs power. In 10 points, he describes himself as a diabolical engineer of war. Read these lines. They breathe cold confidence. I can construct light and strong bridges. I know methods for destroying every fortress. I can make covered chariots safe and unassailable, which, crashing into the enemy with their artillery, will break any line. He promised the Duke tanks, machine guns, poison gas, and submarines 400 years before their actual invention. And only at the very end, as if reluctantly, in a tiny postscript, he adds a phrase full of hidden arrogance. Also, I can sculpt in marble, bronze, and clay, and in painting, I can do anything that may be done, as well as any other, whoever he may be. What a bitter irony. The greatest artist in history is forced to pretend to be a weaponsmith and a killer to get a job. He sells death to have the opportunity to study life. He dons the mask of Mars, hiding the vulnerable soul of Apollo beneath it. The year is 1482. He rides into Milan. But the paradox continues. He brings the Duke not blueprints for deadly machines, nor a painting. In his hands is a silver lyre he had cast himself in the shape of a horse's skull. He presents himself to the court not as a military strategist, but as a musician, an improviser, a virtuoso. Ludovico Sforza was charmed, but the real drama unfolded not in the throne room, but in the artist's workshop. In 1490, on the day of St. Mary Magdalene, a creature appeared on Leonardo's doorstep who would change his life forever. He was a 10-year-old boy, the son of a poor peasant, with the face of a cherub and a soul already touched by rot. His name was Gian Giacomo Caprote da Oreno, but history would remember him by the nickname the master himself gave him, Salaì. What does this name mean? In the Tuscan dialect, it means the little devil, or spawn of Satan. And this was no affectionate pet name. It was a statement of fact. On the second day in the house, this angelic child steals money from his master's purse. On the third day, he knocks over a pitcher of expensive oil. He lies. He is insolent. He breaks things and sells Leonardo's drawings behind the master's back to buy himself sweets. We open Leonardo's notebooks from that period and see something astonishing. The man who described the movement of water and the flight of birds with the dispassion of a scientist suddenly begins to keep petty, bitter accounts. Like a shopkeeper, he records his ward's every crime. A thief, a liar, stubborn, a glutton, he scrawls in ink in the margins. and every word sounds like a verdict. He scrupulously notes the cost of a stolen silver stylus, the price of broken dishes, the expense of cloaks that Salaì immediately dirties or loses. But here lies the greatest mystery. So why did he not throw him out? Why did the genius, obsessed with order and harmony, tolerate this chaos in his home, not for a year or two, but for 25 long years? The answer lies in that very obsession with beauty that was a religion for Leonardo. Salaì possessed a physical appearance that hypnotized the artist, a shock of golden curls, a chiseled profile, an androgynous grace that blurred the line between male and female. Leonardo looked at him and saw not a thieving boy, but the living embodiment of his aesthetic ideals. He forgave him everything for the chance to transfer those features onto canvas. Look closely at the master's later works. Look at the face of John the Baptist emerging from the darkness with a mysterious, almost mocking smile. This is not the face of an ascetic who ate locusts in the desert. It is the face of Salaì. Look at the angels with their sensual, full lips and moist eyes. That is him too. Leonardo dressed his little devil in luxurious clothes. He bought him doublets of silver brocade lined with velvet and pink stockings, spending more on his servant's wardrobe than on his own. It was a strange, agonizing attachment. Salaì was his model, his student, his servant, and perhaps his tormentor. Freud and many researchers after him saw clear signs of homoerotic attraction in their relationship. To deny this is to turn a blind eye to the truth. However, reducing their bond to mere physical desire would be an oversimplification. For Leonardo, Salaì was a mirror reflecting his own pull toward the forbidden, the side of life where instinct, not reason, held sway. While Leonardo sought to comprehend the laws of the universe, a man who broke every human law lived by his side. The master who could design the perfect city found himself powerless against the whims of one spoiled youth. Yet even this passion paled in comparison to the workings of his mind when he was alone. While Salaì was trying on new outfits, Leonardo received a commission intended to be a simple portrait of a duke's mistress, but which would become a revolution. Cecilia Gallerani entered his workshop, holding a creature with a bite sharper than any little devil. It was a commission he could not refuse, one that any other artist would have turned into mere flattery. Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, wished to immortalize his favorite, Cecilia Gallerani. She was only 16 years old, wrote poetry in Latin, engaged in philosophical debates with the university's finest minds, and was pregnant with the ruler's illegitimate child. For Leonardo, this became a challenge. How could he paint a mistress to look like a saint, yet remain desirable? How could he unite sin and innocence on a single walnut panel? Look at this portrait. It is not a static mask like those painted before him. It is a captured moment. Cecilia does not look at us. Her head is turned sharply to the right, as if someone has just entered the room, perhaps the Duke himself. For the first time in the history of painting, Leonardo depicts not just a face, but the movement of the soul. We can almost hear the unseen creak of the door. We feel her sudden focus, her restrained breath. But the main mystery is the animal in her arms. Why an ermine? The official story for courtly flatterers was that it symbolized purity and moderation. The ermine, it was believed, would rather let hunters kill it than stain its snow-white fur with dirt. What an elegant lie for the portrait of a kept woman. However, Leonardo, a master of double meanings, wove entirely different symbols into the canvas. Gale in Greek means weasel or ermine, a direct play on the Gallerani surname, but it also represents the Duke himself. Ludovico was nicknamed l'ermellino, or the ermine. And look how the 16-year-old girl's hand grips the predator's neck, powerfully, yet gently. She is holding her master. Her fingers are long and aristocratic, but with disturbingly precise joints and tense tendons that mirror the curve of the beast's paw. This is no longer just a portrait of a beauty. It is a psychological puzzle. The predator is tamed, but its claws are extended. It is calm, yet ready to bite. Modern X-rays have shown us what lies hidden beneath the layers of paint. Leonardo repainted the animal 3 times. At first, it wasn't there at all. Then a small, gray creature appeared. Only in the final version did this muscular, anatomically exaggerated ermine emerge, looking more like a mythical beast than a real animal. The creature conceals Cecilia's abdomen, the very place where an heir, a threat to legitimate power, was growing. Leonardo had created a masterpiece of diplomacy and ambiguity. But while his brush detailed the pearl necklace on Cecilia's neck, his mind was elsewhere. He looked at her hand and saw not just the beauty of her skin, but a mechanism: bones, muscles, phalanges, flexor tendons. He was beginning to feel constrained by the limits of painting. He wanted to know what lay deeper, beneath the velvet dress, under the pale skin, beneath life itself. While the court admired Lady with an Ermine, Leonardo was already preparing for a project that would overshadow all the paintings in the world. A project of 70 tons of bronze that would become both his greatest triumph and his most bitter tragedy. This was not merely a statue. It was an act of defiance hurled at eternity. Leonardo planned to create a monument to Francesco Sforza, the father of the reigning duke. But in his hands, any commission became a test of the limits of what was possible. Other sculptors cast life-sized horses. Leonardo decided to create a leviathan. Over 7 meters tall, weighing 70 tons of bronze. No one since antiquity had dared to attempt such madness. He prepared for this for 16 years. 16 years. Just consider that number. He practically took up residence in the ducal stables, drawing horses in motion, at rest, and in a rage. He measured their proportions and compiled tables. He dissected fallen animals to understand how muscles attach to bones. His notebooks from that period are not an artist's sketches, but the blueprints of a mad engineer. How could such a behemoth be cast in a single pour? How to prevent the molten bronze from cooling as it flowed into the mold? He invented a new system of furnaces. He calculated everything down to the last ounce of metal. He was ready to perform a miracle. In 1493, in the courtyard of the Sforza Castle, he unveiled a full-scale clay model, a colossal figure. His contemporaries froze in sacred awe. It was so perfect, so alive, that it seemed the clay beast would draw a breath and bring down the castle walls with its neigh. All that remained was the final step. 70 tons of bronze were already prepared, The furnaces awaited the fire. But as we know, history has a cruel sense of humor. Clouds gathered on the horizon. King Charles VII of France marched his troops into Italy. Milan was under threat, and Duke Ludovico Sforza, the great patron of the arts, made a decision that sounds like a verdict on the entire Renaissance era. He ordered the bronze intended for the monument to be confiscated. All the metal, all 70 tons, was sent to be melted down. It was cast into cannons. Art had lost to war. Leonardo's dream, half a lifetime of work, was turned into instruments of murder. Can you imagine the devastation, the profound silence that fell upon his soul? He did not scream or make a scene. He simply wrote a single, chillingly desperate phrase in his diary. Of the horse I will say nothing, for I know the times. But the worst was yet to come. When French troops finally captured Milan in 1499, the clay giant stood defenseless in the castle courtyard. Gascon archers, drunk on wine and victory, saw the masterpiece as an excellent target. They competed in marksmanship, firing arrows into its colossal body. They laughed as they destroyed what a genius had spent years creating. Rain and wind finished the job. Water seeped into the arrow holes. The clay softened, sagged, and turned into a formless mound of mud. The great horse died before it was ever born. It was a lesson Leonardo would never forget. Matter is fragile. Bronze can be melted down, clay washed away by rain, canvas rotted. The only thing truly eternal is the idea. But how can an idea be preserved if the very walls you paint on begin to crumble before the paint is even dry? For it was at this time, in the refectory of the Santa Maria della Grazia monastery, that he had already begun his next battle against time, a battle he also seemed destined to lose. Imagine the monastery's dining hall, the noise of shifting benches, the clatter of dishes, the heavy smell of boiled cabbage and cheap wine. And above it all, on the end wall, the moment time stood still, the moment Christ utters the terrible words, "One of you will betray me." Leonardo received this commission from Ludovico Sforza in 1495. It was meant to be a conventional fresco, but Leonardo da Vinci hated fresco. The buon fresco technique is a dictatorship of plaster. The artist must paint quickly on wet lime before it sets and absorbs the paint forever. There is no room for error, no time for long contemplation, no chance to step back and return a week later. It is a craft for quick hands, not deep minds. Leonardo, however, painted slowly. He might stand before the wall for hours without touching it with his brush, merely contemplating and constructing the geometry of betrayal in his mind. And so he made a fatal mistake. He decided to cheat nature. Instead of the traditional technique, he invented his own medium, a mixture of oil and tempera applied to a dry wall coated with a layer of resin, gesso, and mastic. This allowed him to work as he was accustomed, applying layer upon layer to achieve his signature sfumato, the haze in which contours dissolve. He wanted to transfer the magic of oil painting to a monumental wall, but the monastery wall bordering the kitchen was damp. Moisture began its destructive work even before the master had applied his final brushstroke. Leonardo worked on The Last Supper for 3 years, and those 3 years became a living hell for the monastery's prior. The prior complained to the Duke that the artist spent half the day in contemplation instead of wielding his brush like a gardener with a hoe. He demanded speed. He demanded completion. Leonardo's reply has gone down in history as a model of elegant revenge, of genius schooling a bureaucrat. He explained to the Duke that the greatest minds create more the less they work with their hands, adding that he had two unresolved problems: the face of Christ, whose unearthly beauty he despaired of capturing, and the face of Judas. "I am still searching for a model for the traitor," he said, looking at the Duke but speaking loudly enough for the prior to hear. "I walk through the foulest dens of Milan, studying the faces of thieves and murderers. But if I fail to find anyone whose face reflects such baseness of soul, I will, with your permission, use the head of this prior who so impatiently hurries me." The prior fell silent. Judas found his face, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The masterpiece began to die almost immediately. Just 20 years after its creation, while Leonardo was still alive, the paint began to flake off in scales. The walls sweated, rejecting the foreign compound. The great Vasari, seeing the work in the mid-16th century, called it a dull stain. Leonardo had created the greatest painting in the Christian world on a foundation of sand. It was a tragedy he was acutely aware of. He watched as cracks crept across the Savior's face, as mold consumed the apostles' hands. He tried to create eternity, but had only made a ghost, vanishing before his very eyes. Perhaps it was this sight of slow decay that pushed him toward the idea that truth must be sought not on the surface, but within. If paint flakes from a wall like skin from dead flesh, then what lies beneath it? What makes that flesh live, breathe, and feel pain? The answer lay not in a sunlit artist's studio, but on a cold marble slab in an anatomy theater under the cover of night. Imagine the scene, for it requires strong nerves. Florence is asleep. In the damp cellars of the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova, a single candle flickers. At that time, the church viewed dissection with deep suspicion. It was an act that bordered on heresy, a dirty trade for barbers and butchers, not for creators of beauty. Yet Leonardo crossed this threshold more than 30 times. It was hell. In the 15th century, there was no formalin, no refrigeration. There was only the nauseating, thick stench of decay which, as he confessed in his notebooks, could drive one mad and strip away all sense of beauty. A corpse would begin to blacken, bloat, and fall apart faster than the artist could sketch the intricate web of muscles. He had to work at a frantic pace, fighting back waves of nausea, inhaling the sweetish smell of death to understand the secret of life. He approached the human body not as a doctor seeking the cause of a disease, but as a brilliant mechanic dismantling a complex clockwork mechanism. With chilling composure, he used tiny wooden props to hold the eyelids of the dead wide open, peering into their glazed eyes. He peeled back the skin layer by layer, as carefully as if removing a precious silk garment, revealing first the network of bluish veins, then the red fibers of muscle, and finally, the whiteness of bone. What was he searching for in this bloody mess? Not just anatomical accuracy for his paintings. That would have been too small a goal for the scale of his genius. Leonardo was searching for the physical location of the soul. Medieval scholasticism claimed that the soul, the sensus communis, resided in the third ventricle of the brain. And so Leonardo, armed with the finest saws and scalpels, opened skulls, probing through the gray matter, trying to find a tangible vessel for the divine spirit. He wanted to see precisely where an intangible thought becomes the movement of a hand, where anger is born, and where memory hides. Look at his anatomical drawings from that period. They are executed with such tenderness, with such a frightening, captivating aesthetic, that they seem to be works of high art rather than medical diagrams. The lines are flawless, the shading perfect, but they came at a terrible cost. The hands that by day created the most tender and enigmatic smiles of Madonnas were by night elbow-deep in cadaveric fluid, blood, and fat. He never found the soul in the ventricles of the brain, but what he discovered during these nightmarish vigils overturned the very understanding of human nature itself. Disappointed in his search for the soul within the skull, he turned his gaze to where life begins. Look at the famous sheet from the Windsor Codex, a fetus in the maternal womb. Before Leonardo, physicians depicted unborn children as tiny, fully formed adults, simply reduced in size, like homunculi. Leonardo was the first in history to see and draw the truth. He depicted the child in its natural curled position, comparing it to a seed slumbering in the core of a fruit. Just think, by the light of a tallow candle, amidst the stench of decay, he drew life with such tenderness as if holding his own son, whom he never had. But for him, anatomy was not only a hymn to life, but also a cold-blooded analysis of death. In the winter of 1507, in the same Florentine hospital of Santa Maria Nuova, Leonardo spent hours at the bedside of a frail old man. This man, whose skin resembled dry parchment, assured the master that he was over 100 years old and felt no pain, only an all-consuming weakness. Leonardo talked with him, joked, and watched the spark fade from his tired eyes. And as soon as the old man drew his last breath, passing away, as they say, with the smile of the righteous, Leonardo committed an act that chills the blood. He did not call for a priest. He did not mourn his companion. Immediately, while the body was still warm, he took up his scalpel. He needed to understand the mechanics of this sweet death. Why had the mechanism stopped so smoothly, without agony or suffocation? Opening the chest cavity of the 100-year-old man, Leonardo discovered what modern medicine would not name atherosclerosis for centuries. He described veins that were tortuous and hardened like the roots of an old tree, an artery so narrowed that blood could no longer nourish the heart. He held the cause of death in his hands. He saw the mechanics of fading life, and his fingers, covered in fat and ichor, immediately transferred this knowledge to paper. Herein lies the greatest paradox of Leonardo the anatomist. Picture this scene. Night. A ghastly silence. A genius stands over a ravaged chest cavity, his hands elbow-deep in filth and death. Yet, look at the drawing that emerges at this moment. The lines are impeccably clean, the shading is light and airy, and the handwriting is calligraphically perfect. There is no trembling, no revulsion, only the divine, almost inhuman detachment of an observer. He understood the structure of heart valves 300 years before official science. He described the circulation of blood long before William Harvey. If only Leonardo had published his works then, at the beginning of the 16th century. But if medicine was an attempt to understand life, Leonardo's next step was an attempt to master death. For the history of medicine ends where the history of war begins. If Leonardo had published his works, the world would have changed. Instead, he chose to change his own destiny, making the most unthinkable, the darkest turn in his life. In the summer of 1502, this vegetarian who bought birds at the market just to set them free entered the service of Italy's most bloodthirsty monster, Cesare Borgia. Who was Cesare? The illegitimate son of a pope, a fratricide, a rapist, and a brilliant strategist. A man whose name made kings turn pale and cardinals cross themselves. And it was this man who issued Leonardo a letter of safe conduct, granting him the title of our most excellent and beloved architect and general engineer. Consider the irony. The hands that had so tenderly drawn the smile of the Madonna were now drafting fortification plans and calculating the trajectories of cannonballs designed to tear human flesh to shreds. Why did he do it? Was it for money? Out of fear? Or perhaps the cold curiosity of a scientist eager to witness the efficiency of absolute power? Leonardo traveled through Romagna, inspecting fortresses. He created the famous map of Imola, which was not just a drawing but a God's eye view. For the first time in history, a map was drawn from directly above, like a floor plan, without the perspective distortions common in the art of the time. It was an instrument of total control. Borgia looked at this map and saw a field for his deadly game. Leonardo saw the geometry of the earth. It was there, in campaign tents, reeking of sweat and iron, that perhaps the strangest intellectual triumvirate in history was formed. Cesare Borgia, the sword; Leonardo da Vinci, the brain; and a third, a Florentine secretary with a gaze as sharp as a razor, Niccolò Machiavelli. They spent nights in conversation. Machiavelli, observing Borgia, would write his famous work, The Prince, a textbook on cynical power. Meanwhile, Leonardo sought a way to divert rivers to deprive the enemy city of Pisa of its water. He designed covered chariots with scythes, meant to mow down infantry like wheat. Two geniuses, mesmerized by evil, stood over a map of Italy that Borgia was carving up with his sword. But this romance with the devil could not last forever. Reality, from which Leonardo so often hid in his drawings, caught up with him on New Year's Eve. On the night of December 31st, 1502, in the town of Senigallia, Borgia committed his most infamous act of betrayal. He invited his rebellious captains to negotiations, greeted them with a smile, embraced them, and then gave a signal to his guards. They were strangled on the spot. Leonardo was there. He witnessed this masterpiece of political treachery. And it was likely in that moment that the veil fell from his eyes. He understood that his perfect machine served not an abstract order, but a concrete madness. The engineer realized the mechanism was broken. Leonardo fled. He left Borgia's service without warning, abandoning his salary and patronage, escaping a stench of blood that not even the most exquisite perfumes of the Renaissance could mask. He returned to Florence, but there would be no peace for him there. For on the horizon, the shadow of another titan was already looming, a man who hated Leonardo with every fiber of his being and was ready to challenge the very concept of art. Florence in 1503 did not meet its prodigal son with warm embraces, but with a cold, appraising gaze. The city had changed. It had a new idol, a new predator who thirsted for the old lion's blood. He was only 29 years old. He had a nose broken in a brawl, the temperament of a rabid dog, and a talent that seemed to rival that of the creator himself. His name was Michelangelo Buonarroti. Their clash was as inevitable as the collision of two storm fronts. Leonardo represented aristocracy, cold intellect, exquisite pink tunics, and the scent of rosewater. Michelangelo was fury, grime, marble dust embedded in his pores, and a habit of sleeping in his boots for weeks on end. Ice and flame, ether and stone. The Gonfaloniere of Florence, Piero Soderini, decided to stage the greatest duel in the history of art, commissioning them to paint two opposing walls in the Grand Hall of 500 in the Palazzo Vecchio. Leonardo was to depict the Battle of Anghiari, and Michelangelo the Battle of Cascina. The entire city held its breath. This was not just the painting of walls, it was a war of philosophies. Leonardo depicted war as passione bestialissima, the most bestial madness. In his cartoon, horses bit each other, and the faces of men were contorted with inhuman rage. He wanted to show the ugliness of violence. Michelangelo, in contrast, celebrated the heroic body, the power of muscles, the triumph of physical strength. But the deepest wound was inflicted not with a brush, but with a word. History has preserved for us a scene in the Piazza Santa Trinita, a scene so full of bitterness that it still stings after 5 centuries. Leonardo, strolling with his customary entourage, was discussing the subtleties of a verse by Dante. The disheveled and dirty Michelangelo, passing by, overheard them. When someone called out to him, he exploded. "You explain it to them," he shouted in the master's face. "You, who designed a horse only to be unable to cast it in bronze and abandoned it in disgrace." The silence that fell over the square was more terrible than the shout. Michelangelo had struck at the most painful spot, the theme of incompletion, the ghost of the Milanese horse that haunted Leonardo. The young Titan had publicly called the old king a failure. And what did Leonardo do? He remained silent. He simply blushed and could find no reply. For the first time, his eloquence, his shield of irony and wisdom, had cracked. Then came the catastrophe in the hall itself. Leonardo, true to his passion for experimentation, rejected the reliable fresco technique. He wanted to paint in oil on the wall, using a recipe from Pliny the Elder. He set up huge braziers to dry the paint, but the heat was uneven. The upper part of the painting began to darken, while the lower part simply started to run. The great battle of Anghiari was melting like wax before its creator's eyes. The masterpiece was dying just as it was born. Michelangelo, too, never finished his work. He was summoned to Rome by the Pope. The Battle of the Titans ended in a draw, leaving behind only stains on damp plaster and unfulfilled hopes. Yet it was at this moment, amidst the ruins of his ambitions in 1503, that Leonardo took an action that defied all commercial logic. This man, who had rejected the pleas of Queen Isabella d'Este and ignored the Pope's commands, suddenly accepted a commission from an insignificant Florentine silk merchant, Francesco del Giocondo. He was to paint a portrait of the merchant's wife, Lisa Gherardini. She was 24 years old, not of noble birth, not fabulously wealthy, and by the standards of the time, not considered a great beauty. Why? Why did he take on this work? Perhaps because in her face he saw something he had been searching for in dissected skulls and geological faults. He turned his workshop into a theater. Vasari tells us that while Lisa posed, Leonardo surrounded her with musicians, singers, and jesters. He wanted to banish from her face the customary melancholy that had become a mask on all portraits of the era. He needed a spark, a movement of the soul. And here, the magic that art historians would call sfumato, meaning vanished like smoke, was born. Leonardo understood that there are no lines in nature, only the boundaries between light and shadow. He began to apply paint in layers thinner than a human hair, dozens, hundreds of transparent layers. If you look at the corners of her mouth or eyes, you will not see a brushstroke. You will see a shadow that vibrates. It is an optical trap. If you look directly at her lips, the smile disappears, dissolving into a haze. But the moment you look into her eyes, your peripheral vision catches that shadow, and it seems as if she is smiling. She is alive because she is ever-changing. But here is what turns this story into a detective novel. The portrait, which should have taken 3 to 4 months, Leonardo worked on for 4 years. And then he never gave it to the client. The merchant, Francesco, never received the image of his wife. Leonardo simply packed up the poplar wood panel and took it with him. Why? Had he not finished it? Or, on the contrary, did he realize he had created something that could not belong to a silk merchant? Look at the landscape behind her. Those are not the hills of Tuscany. It is a primordial land of water-weathered rocks and bridges leading nowhere. Lisa Gherardini was no longer a woman. She had become a vessel into which Leonardo poured all his knowledge of the universe, the geology of the rocks, the hydrodynamics of the water, the anatomy of a smile, the psychology of a gaze. Everything he had studied for 50 years was fused into this small rectangle. He stole her from her husband to make her eternal. This portrait would become his obsession, his curse, and his only faithful companion. He would carry it in his saddlebags across the Alps, protecting it from dampness and barbarians. But in those same bags, next to the divine Lisa, lay something far heavier than a poplar panel. Thousands, tens of thousands of pages, a chaotic paper labyrinth where his soul truly lived. We call them his codices. Open any page at random and you will feel a sense of vertigo. The lines run backward, from right to left, mirror writing. To read his thoughts, you need to hold a mirror to the page. Why? Romantics loved to claim he was encrypting his heresies from the Inquisition, hiding secrets from church spies. But the truth is likely more mundane, and for that reason, more tragic. Leonardo was left-handed. Writing from left to right with the left hand smudges fresh ink. He simply adapted. Or perhaps his brain was truly wired differently. Maybe he saw the world in a mirror image where cause and effect were reversed. Look closely at these sketches. On the yellowed paper, the 15th century crumbles to dust. We see armored vehicles resembling turtles, spewing fire, prototypes of tanks. We see a giant screw twisting into the sky, the great-grandfather of the helicopter. We see diving suits with breathing tubes. Leonardo was a prophet of technology, trapped in time. He designed war machines for a conflict that would happen 400 years later. He was a time traveler, washed ashore in an era that could only offer him wood, canvas, and bronze, while his blueprints cried out for titanium, plastic, and aviation fuel. And herein lies his greatest tragedy, the tragedy of incompletion. His mind was a maelstrom of ideas. An idea would ignite. He would see its perfect form in his head and begin to write it down feverishly, only to be distracted by a new thought. The flight of a bird would lead him to ponder air currents, the wind to water, water to blood circulation. He wanted to understand everything at once. He started treatises on anatomy and abandoned them. He began research on light and never finished. His perfectionism paralyzed him. He understood that his hands could never create the ideal device his mind envisioned. In the margins of one manuscript, among geometric drawings, his hand, trembling with despair, wrote a phrase that chills the blood. Tell me, was anything ever done? Not if it was good, but was it done? He felt like a man who had started 1,000 projects and finished not one. A great failure whose brilliant insights gathered dust in chests. And with this feeling of deep, corrosive loneliness, he decided to make one last attempt to find his place. He set his sights on the eternal city, Rome, the Vatican. There was a new pope. There was money. There was power. Leonardo packed his mirrors, his notebooks, and his Gioconda. He went to Rome seeking recognition, but he did not yet know that Rome had already chosen new heroes, and there was no place for the old magician. Rome did not greet him with fanfares, but with a polite, killing indifference. The year was 1513. Leonardo was 61 years old. For that era, he was an old man, a relic of the past century, a living monument covered in dust. The Vatican at that time resembled a disturbed beehive. Pope Leo X, the portly and cheerful Medici, had turned the Holy See into an endless carnival. But at this festival of life, Leonardo was cast as a jester, not a prophet. He took up residence in the Belvedere, but he felt less like a guest and more like a ghost. While he arranged his flasks and laid out his drafts, history was being made beyond his walls, and there was no role for him in it. In the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo, that furious, grimy, and crude Florentine, was already breaking his neck painting the ceiling with titanic figures. In the papal apartments, the young Raphael Sanzio reigned, handsome, courteous, a court favorite whose Madonnas were as sweet as sacramental wine. And what of Leonardo? Pope Leo X, upon learning that the master had begun work on a painting by first developing a special varnish, merely waved a chubby hand and said, "Alas, this man will never accomplish anything, for he thinks of the end before the beginning." And indeed, Leonardo did not paint. His brushes dried up. Instead of grand canvases, he wasted precious time on strange, unsettling trifles. He dissected lizards, attached wings made from the skin of other lizards, and gave them artificial eyes and horns to frighten his servants, calling his creation a dragon. He occupied himself with geometry, endlessly, squaring the circle. He studied acoustics, but in the cellars of his mind, a darkness was brewing. He needed truth, and for him, truth had always lain within the body. He once again took up the scalpel. In the hospital of Santo Spirito, under the cover of the Roman night, he continued his great work, dissecting corpses. He wanted to describe the origin of the voice, the mechanics of the heart, the mystery of birth. But Rome was not Milan. Here, walls had ears, and envy had long arms. The blow came from someone he had expected help from. His German assistant, a mirror maker, resentful over petty disputes about his salary, wrote an accusation that went straight to the Vatican. The charge was monstrous: necromancy, desecration of the dead, godlessness, communing with the devil. Leonardo was accused of trying to steal the Creator's secrets by digging into rotting flesh. The Pope's reaction was immediate and merciless. Leonardo da Vinci, the greatest anatomist of his time, was officially forbidden from visiting the hospital morgue. He was banned from performing dissections. This was the end. His primary tool of knowledge had been taken from him. His anatomical manuscripts, his life's work, remained scattered sheets that he now hid in chests like criminal evidence. He felt the circle of alienation tightening around him. He wandered the banks of the Tiber, old, lonely, misunderstood. Terrifying drawings appeared in his notebooks, visions of a deluge, cities washed away by giant waves, cliffs collapsing on people, vortices of water and wind destroying all life. This was not mere fantasy. It was a projection of his state of mind. He saw the end of the world because his own world had collapsed. Rome had rejected him. Italy, his homeland, no longer needed his genius. He felt confined, suffocated, as if in a tomb of his own design. But salvation came not from the heavens, but from the north. The young, ambitious King of France, Francis I, a great admirer of Italian art, extended a hand to him. It was more than a job offer. It was an act of rescue. The king told him what Leonardo had waited his whole life to hear, what neither the Medici, the Sforza, nor the Pope had ever said. Here, you will be free to dream, to think, and to create. And so, in the autumn of 1516, the 64-year-old man, wrapped in heavy cloaks, crossed the Alps on the back of a mule. He was going to a foreign land to die. His saddlebags held no gold or precious stones. Inside were just 3 paintings, his entire fortune, the culmination of his titanic efforts. There was St. John the Baptist, with its unsettling, ambiguous smile pointing to the heavens, the Virgin and Child with St. Anne, and the portrait of a Florentine woman he had begun 13 years prior and had not been separated from for a single day. Why did he carry this wooden panel across the mountains, risking damage to the paint? Because it was still not finished. For Leonardo, to finish something was to kill it. The Château de Clos-Lucé in Amboise became his paradise and his final refuge. Francis I showered him with honors the bastard of Vinci could never have dreamed of. He granted him the title of first painter, engineer, and architect to the king, and a pension of 700 gold écus. But the king did not need his cannons, his fortifications, or his plans for draining swamps. He needed Leonardo himself. He needed the voice of a sage. The monarch, ruler of one of Europe's most powerful nations, would visit the old man's workshop, sit on a simple stool, and listen for hours to his discourses on the nature of the soul and the movement of water. The King of France called this common-born Italian his father. But time was the one enemy Leonardo could not defeat, even if he had invented a machine to stop the sun. In 1517, disaster struck. A stroke. His right hand, the same hand that could bend horseshoes and draw the finest lines on a Madonna's eyelids, hung limp and useless. It was dead. For any other artist, this would have been the end. But Leonardo was ambidextrous, or rather, a man whose brain knew no boundaries between hemispheres. He continued to draw with his left hand, but what did he draw? Not beautiful maidens or anatomical diagrams. He drew deluges, whirlwinds of water destroying cities, an apocalypse, the end of the world. He saw nature, which he had revered all his life, rising up to wipe humanity from the face of the earth. May 2nd, 1519. A bedroom in the Château de Clos-Lucé. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn, but the spring light pierces through the gaps. The air is thick with the sweet smell of wax candles and medicinal herbs. He is 67 years old. Giorgio Vasari, that great myth-maker of the Renaissance, paints for us a final fresco worthy of a classical tragedy. King Francis I rushes into the chamber and cradles the dying old man's head, and the great Leonardo breathes his last in the monarch's arms, like a prophet in the arms of his son. Did this truly happen? Dry court chronicles state that on that day, the king was in another castle, celebrating the birth of his second son. But are facts more important than truth? This beautiful lie tells us more about Leonardo than the truth ever could. The world had finally recognized his greatness, even if only on the threshold of oblivion. Kings had bowed their heads before the illegitimate son of a peasant woman. But let us look at his will. Whom did the dying genius remember in his final hours? Not kings or philosophers. His thoughts returned to the one who had tormented his heart for a quarter of a century, his little devil, Salaì. A thief, a liar, a glutton, a man who sold his master's drawings for pennies to buy himself stockings with silver thread. Leonardo left him half of his Milanese vineyard, and most incomprehensibly, he left him paintings, including the very portrait of the Florentine woman with the enigmatic smile, the masterpiece that Leonardo never delivered to its commissioner, that he carried across the Alps, that he worked on until his last breath, was bequeathed to a man incapable of appreciating anything beyond the glint of gold. The irony of fate is cruel and relentless. Salaì would sell the Mona Lisa to King Francis for the fabulous sum of 4,000 gold écus. Just 1 year later, this angel of vice would be killed in a drunken brawl or a duel, shot with an arquebus. The painting that had absorbed a genius's soul became a bargaining chip for a scoundrel. Leonardo lies on high pillows, his breathing growing shallow. He had always feared that his life would be spent in vain. His notebooks contain thousands of pages marked unfinished. Treatises, machines, statues, all remained in draft form. Did he feel the bitterness of defeat? Or, gazing into the encroaching darkness, did he find the answer to his greatest question? He once wrote a phrase that now sounds like his own epitaph. As a well-spent day brings happy sleep, so a life well used brings happy death. The eyes that had seen more than any other person of his era closed. The heart, whose mechanics he had so desperately tried to understand by dissecting human chests, beat its last. Silence filled the room. The great explorer departed for the one land from which he could send back no maps or reports. But a mystery remained. The final code, one he did not encrypt in his manuscripts, but left in plain sight. Who was he, really? History loves simple answers, but in Leonardo's case, any simple answer would be a lie. To call him a painter is to insult the engineer who designed human flight 400 years before the Wright brothers. To call him a scientist is to diminish the creator who, with chiaroscuro alone, that very sfumato, changed our perception of reality. He was not a man of one profession. He was a mirror, a vast, perfectly polished mirror that tried to contain the entire universe, but cracked from the impossibility of reflecting it all. This is his greatest paradox, the one we have unraveled chapter by chapter. Consider his path. He dissected decaying flesh, standing ankle deep in blood and cadaverous fluids, not out of morbid curiosity, but to understand the very muscle that makes the lips curve into a smile. He studied the trajectories of cannonballs and designed tanks, despite being a staunch pacifist who bought caged birds at the market just to set them free. He loved men at the risk of being burned at the stake. Yet it was he who gave the world the absolute, unattainable ideal of femininity. The true Da Vinci Code is not hidden in the positions of the apostles in a fresco or in the secret symbols of a priory. His code is a method of thinking. It is the refusal to see the world as fragmented. For Leonardo, there was no boundary between art and science, between beauty and ugliness, between the flight of a dragonfly and the circulation of blood in the aorta. Everything was connected by invisible threads, and like an obsessed weaver, he spent his entire life trying to find the nodes of this great web. The tragedy of his legacy is staggering. After the master's death, his priceless notebooks, over 13,000 pages, were scattered, lost, used as wrapping paper, or simply left to rot in attics. Had these notes been published immediately after his death, the fields of medicine, mechanics, and geology could have leaped forward by 3 centuries. The world might have had antibiotics and steam engines as early as the 15th century. But Leonardo wrote for himself in his mirror script, as if encrypting his knowledge from a humanity not yet ready for it. And yet he conquered time. His manuscripts were scattered, his frescoes crumbled, his machines were never built in his lifetime. But that very smile, the smile of La Gioconda, which he carried with him until his last breath, remains with us. It gazes at us from behind the bulletproof glass of the Louvre with the same calm, ironic superiority with which Leonardo himself observed the bustle of Florentine streets. In that smile lies the knowledge that life is short, art is eternal, and the mystery of existence can never be fully unraveled. Sigmund Freud, in his attempt to analyze the master's psyche, perhaps said it best. Leonardo da Vinci was like a man who had woken up too early in the darkness, while the others were all still asleep. He wandered through the darkness of his age's ignorance, holding a lantern of reason whose light was too bright for the eyes of his contemporaries. And his greatest tragedy was that, in essence, he had no one to talk to but eternity. We are closing this case, but not the subject. for history is full of such awakened minds whose voices still echo in our own. Thank you for following this journey from Vinci to Amboise with us. This has been Personalities in Detail. Join us for the next investigation.